Welcome back to the Finding Genius video series. I'm joined with Rebecca Kaden. Rebecca is a managing partner with Union Square Ventures in New York. She's formerly a partner with Maveron, a consumer-focused early-stage fund out of San Francisco. Rebecca began her career as a journalist, and I was hoping to start a conversation there, but welcome, Rebecca, and thanks for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me.
So on your career in journalism, I think it would be interesting just to hear, because you spent some time with The Economist and Narrative. I am working with Hearst Ventures, and we're seeing media brands evolve. We're seeing how journalism is kind of traditional journalism publications are being disrupted with Substack and Reddit and all the other subscription-based platforms. I know Union Square Ventures has had some theses on long-form content in the past, but I think I just wanted to hear more about your opinions on long-form content and how things have evolved. Also, I think it'd be an interesting thing for founders to hear from.
Yeah, so I started out my career in journalism, and I love kind of everything about written word. I love literature. I studied it in college, and for a while thought I'd be a Russian literature scholar. I love journalism. I love the idea of stories in all kind of forms. That being said, I've spent very little time from a venture standpoint looking at that market. I've really veered, sometimes there's the case of you know too much, or, you've come from it, so you have other interests. So my perspective on it is much less from an investing point of view, where I just haven't kind of spent that much time. I think the ability kind of across the board to cut out middlemen and to allow individuals to both build direct channels and businesses based on what they love to do is an extremely powerful force we're seeing. And Substack is probably the iteration of that for writing.
Okay.
I think, so I like that whole trend going on, kind of decentralizing jobs and allowing direct channels, both for independence and building your own careers and being able to kind of get your message across. That being said, I think there will always be a role in the world for great journalism. And there's something about training. I was trained as a journalist. I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think one of the great things about trades is you can learn them, and there's apprenticeship. And I am still a believer in this world that there's a place for that.
And when you say trained as a journalist, can you talk a bit about maybe some of the qualities as a journalist? I mean, a lot of VCs are coming from traditional finance or kind of operating backgrounds.
Yeah.
What are the qualities as a journalist, maybe even as a board member, of helping a founder get the story right, or thinking about storytelling, or thinking about the investigative qualities when you are digging into a company? Do any of those play true, or is that more just in past now and currently you're just a VC?
I think one of the great things about venture is that there isn't a set route, right? You don't have to do X to do Y to do Z. And I think that means you wind up with a mishmash of people with various experiences and interests, and kind of the broader the set of interests and experiences on a team that you can have, the better, because you'll, vary perspectives when looking at new opportunities and new ideas. And so I really value that. And I think we have that in our team. I always say whenever I'm asked this question, thank God for Mike Moritz, because then it's easy to point to someone and say, oh, journalism, it's a great route to VC.
Right.
Just look at Mike Moritz. So let us all be, so lucky that that's the path. But I look at it in two ways. I think, journalism is a lot about piecing together stories with probably, more data points than you need and less than you'd like, and developing trust with sources so that they come to you first and that they feel comfortable talking to you, and you can kind of get beneath the sheeny glow of a pitch and to something more authentic behind that. And that's how the best stories emerge. There are certainly parallels to getting to know founders and to thinking about opportunities to invest in, right? It's a lot about trust building and information asymmetry, though potentially less so over time. And about, I think a lot about in those conversations, how can we get off the script and get off the deck and really have an authentic conversation, because we'll be working together for a long time. And that's really also where you learn the most. So the output is extremely different, right? The risk tolerance involved, I think, is extremely different, but there are processy things that I think are similar. And then I certainly believe that when you think about early stage investing, a lot of it is about the ability to tell great stories and to, make people believe that a narrative that you have such conviction in, but it is not yet obvious, is inevitable to some degree. And, some of that is data and a lot of that is storytelling. So I like the part of getting to work with teams on that as well.
Great, great. Yeah, actually, your partner, Fred Wilson, for the book, for Finding Genius, he had actually talked about how being a great storyteller is defined as genius for entrepreneurs. Maybe we can get into that a little bit later. But I think just for level setting and before we get into USV and your theses and your investment areas now, can you talk a bit about your transition? You've worked at two of the top funds and on the consumer side at Maveron, and your transition into VC, into a male-dominated industry, your decision to move from San Francisco to New York and kind of be between those two funds and some of the early consumer brands you worked with. I think just a bit of level setting on the career through venture would be helpful.
Yeah. So I was a journalist. I went to business school, really thinking about kind of the question you just asked around, the future of the word and journalism and publishing, and thought that maybe I would get into that. But like many others in the most cliched of ways, went to Stanford, drank all the technology Kool-Aid, and became a VC. That was not a particularly new or revolutionary path, but got introduced to Maveron while I was in business school by a close mentor of mine there named Bill Campbell, who had passed away a few years ago now, but was a really remarkable person, was known as the coach in Silicon Valley, and mostly spent his time coaching these very, very big name figures, Steve Jobs and Eric Schmidt, and then all the way on the other end. Spent time at Stanford and taught a few classes there and got to know some students. And I was lucky enough to get to know him, and he was super instrumental for me because I went to him and was like, I think I'd like to experiment with going to something like Google or Facebook. And he said, I think you should become a VC. I think that it would kind of work for you and what I know about you. And mostly you should do it with great people. And so he made the introduction to Maveron, where I then spent, I started as an intern and became an associate and a principal and a partner and a general partner, and kind of did the work up the ladder there over the next 6-ish years, and learned just a ton. Maveron has a really amazing mentorship culture and training culture, and learned a lot about great consumer investing, which I really enjoyed. Then met the partnership at USV, and the combination of getting back to New York, which was where I'm from originally and is super appealing to me, and just the approach of USV as a very thesis-driven firm really resonated. And once again, I think this is really all about doing it with people you respect and admire and have fun with, and found that in the USV partnership. So joined USV about 4 years ago, and we've really worked together to evolve the thesis and where our interests sit and where we're spending time. We've launched a climate fund since then and spend a lot of time on climate sustainability. And so I've definitely expanded what I've focused on away from only the consumer side to really across the board that fits with our thesis of where can you leverage networks and platforms and protocols to broaden access to drive up value and down cost in systematic ways.
Right. I think that's probably one of the most fascinating things within venture across the entire country is USV's thesis evolution from 1.0 to 3.0, and the generational shift of now you've completely informed, or not completely, but in a big part informed 3.0 and this new opportunity fund and the climate fund. Can you talk a bit about how that evolution has, how the theses have evolved and where 3.0 is focused now in relation to 1.0 and where maybe USV is spending more time?
Totally. So, USV has always been a thesis-driven firm since it was started by Fred and Brad back in 2003-ish. The thesis really started with the thesis around network effects, that equity value would be created through large networks of engaged users. And that, now is a relatively obvious thesis that has driven, a lot of value across the venture ecosystem inside USV and a lot outside of USV. At the time was less so. And really drove a lot of the investing in those first funds, companies like Twitter and Etsy and Indeed and things like that. From there, the thesis really evolved. And that core thesis that equity value is driven through large networks of engaged users has not changed. I would argue that every other thesis is an evolution and a build versus a stop and go, start something new. So that kind of fundamental building block is really what we still think a lot about. But Thesis 2.0 really evolved that to think not only about horizontal networks, but vertical networks. How can that same concept apply to various verticals, as well as the underlying infrastructure underneath them? If you have these networks emerging, what are the tools and protocols you need that are going to allow the networks to scale on top of them? So things like Twilio and Stripe, Cloudflare. So that was kind of Thesis 2.0. Within that was a decentralization thesis, that part of what networks do is they aggregate data and users, and there needed to be a counteracting force to keep innovation free and to keep the internet decentralized. And that is where a lot of the blockchain investing began and kind of stemmed from there. So that was really part of Thesis 2.0. Thesis 3.0, which we really crafted now a few years ago when I was joining, was a lot about what does that create. So now you have horizontal networks, you have vertical networks, you have the infrastructure underlying them. What does that allow for? And what we've been really thinking about is what can be built on top to broaden access. How can you leverage those platforms and protocols to drive up value and down cost in systematic ways, both on the consumer and enterprise side? And we think about that in financial services, in healthcare, in education, as well as the underlying networks to support them. The climate thesis as evolved is a little bit different because it's probably broader, but we're still thinking structurally, how do you drive access into a system there?
And I think that's some of the areas that I wanted to focus the chunk of our conversation. I know we don't have too much time left, but in terms of broadening access within education, with this 3.0, you've invested in companies like Skillshare and Duolingo, and recently invested in OutSchool. Can you share more about how companies such as OutSchool or the other education companies you were looking at, where broadening access becomes the big piece and the big lever forward for you all to invest, especially in a venture market that's getting more and more competitive, how this thesis-driven approach is actually working to USV's advantage, specifically within Edtech, and then we can do that in healthcare and climate after that, which would be helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of that is just thesis-driven investing, and part of it is our specific thesis, right? I think in general, as markets heat up, as they get more crowded, the typical supply and demand conversation, capital becomes an increasing commodity. You think about, kind of what you're worth and how you add value. The more specific the thing you can offer, the more pointed we can be. We think two things. One, we're going to have better conversations with entrepreneurs. We're going to start from a different place. We always talk internally that our best meetings with entrepreneurs aren't pitch me your business, right? It's, hey, you have a bunch of theses you've developed about a market. We've been thinking about that market too and have a bunch of theses. Let's talk about them and see if there's alignment. And if there's alignment, the rest will work out, right? Like products evolve, approaches evolve, but fundamental alignment on what you're doing in the market and where it's going, and that we look at that market in the same way is something we really, really look for. We also think it allows a conversation with an entrepreneur that's not, is your business good? I really hate that construct, right? Like someone is thinking about their business their entire life, right? This is their life. And we're supposed to meet them for 45 minutes and tell you, do I think your business is good? Right. It's kind of a ridiculous thing. And so it helps reframe it into, are we looking at it the same way? Like, are our interests aligned? If you're interested in something, is that where we should be invested too, given what we're trying to focus on? And we raise funds designed for that. We raise funds very specifically that there are going to be many very big, great businesses that are out there that aren't a fit for us, and that's okay. We don't need to take a top-down approach and be in X percentage of multi-billion-dollar companies because of our fund size. We just need to be right enough on the ones we're in, or some of the ones we're in. And that really supports this thesis-driven approach. So it also, in a market that has a lot going on, creates focus, right? So we can look at stuff and say, this is up our alley and this isn't, right? And we shouldn't spend time on this because it's just not where we're focused. We really like a small dedicated team, and that allows us to do that because otherwise we would need many more people to process, the opportunities in the market. So that's kind of thesis-driven investing in general. Our thesis specifically, I think, the internet is maturing now, and we spend a fair amount of our time on, Web3 stuff, on crypto in general, and which is not maturing yet, and it's much different and much earlier. But on the Web2 stuff, and so we think it's important to think what the infrastructure has allowed for. and we're interested and want to spend our time. I think one of the most important things USB has done for me personally as an investor is taught me to say, this sounds cool, but I'm not interested. Right? Like I am only going to do a very small number of investments a year. I have to be interested. And the team is aligned around an interest around how technology can drive access, how we can make things previously accessible to few, accessible to a lot more. Not everyone's working on that, but enough are that we think there can be real value in that.
And on the broadening access piece, I think an interesting area to spend some time would be on women's health. And I think you led the investment in modern fertility. Can you talk a bit about how broadening access for women's health? We've seen a number of companies focus specifically on fertility. Modern Fertility is now partnered up with Roe, and they're going to broaden access through that collaboration. Where else do you see areas within women's health or just healthcare in general where access is still limited? Or do you believe then now you begin to evolve beyond healthcare into different kind of technology formats and services businesses in order to do that? Or is it still specifically focused on individual verticals like women's health and fertility or other areas where you see opportunity?
A lot about both. With healthcare, I think about the application layer, which are things like modern fertility or Nurex that are, going to the end user in a format to broaden access. And then what I've been calling the enabling layer. Where are there horizontal plays that are going to make those application layer, if you're going to market that and believe that digital health is massively transforming and is going to have many more players and many more big players in the next decade than it has in the last, what new tool sets and kind of underlying infrastructure are you going to need to allow those to grow? Because not all of them are going to reinvent the same wheel and be full stack, right? Like you think about Twilio, you think about Shopify and other verticals, right? Like what are the equivalents in healthcare? So we've been spending time on both of those things. We're nowhere close to having kind of tapped, broadening access in healthcare. If you think about how opaque pricing is, how few people in this country have access to great healthcare, how closely it's related to, socioeconomic status, how few drugs and systems have been even tested with women as part of those trials versus just men, how much stigma and, emotion plays into what drugs people can get and where they live. Like there's a lot of areas that, are still very, very ripe to innovate on, and we're quite interested in, women's health is a mess. Modern fertility is a great business and proud to be part of Roe and doing a great job, but it's only one piece of a very large, puzzle for women's health. And so we hope to do much more there.
And are there specific areas where you're waiting for a founder to approach you on specifically within healthcare? Or is it more, again, when you meet them, you'll look for that alignment and if you think of the interests the same way and on how they're building and what they're building for?
I think in healthcare, I think this is a good question because it varies a lot on industry. Like in education, I think we're very, very specific on what we're looking for and really know. I think in healthcare, we're still really evolving it in what that means, in where it fits with what we're doing, right? Like we are not a great firm to do drug development, right? And if you think about something like fertility, that's something where we had a really clear thesis, right? That I think, how do you drive access into female fertility? A big piece of that is going to be in drug development. It's going to be making IVF drugs generic and making those processes cheaper. Those are big businesses to be built. It's not what we focus on, right? And then there was another, so we said, okay, what else is there? The information is so opaque, both about our own bodies and about the process, right? For women, community is so hard to find. And so we thought there's going to be several big businesses emerge here. Many will be science-oriented, but some will be consumer-oriented. They will take out the mystery. They will make you feel, handheld to a really opaque process. They will give you information about yourself and what's going on that you really need. That was the thesis on modern fertility, and will be the thesis on others as well. So similarly, I think there are other kind of categories that a similar divide will happen, that there will be big science oriented businesses built. We are unlikely to be the best investor for that. And then there will be application layer consumer businesses built that help demystify, create comfort, create price transparency, and overall, hopefully, eventually lower prices.
Okay. And I think just to switch directions for a second on this climate crisis thesis, on the back of all the events that we've seen recently, and can you talk a bit more about, is Climate Crisis and the fund that you all have raised and kind of pitched to LPs a whole new category, or these companies been building for the last 20 years and now it's exclusively called Climate Crisis and Climate Tech? Or can you talk a bit about some of the areas where you see new opportunities in carbon credit transfers and services businesses and kind of B2B, whether it's consumer or B2B, on how you're looking at it and how you're structuring funds specifically around that?
I think the opportunity around the climate crisis has definitely existed for many years and people have built, but a bunch of things need to come together for massive businesses to emerge. One is a overall sense of urgency, right? And I think that is building. One, people are seeing it around them with what's going on with, weather events and crises. We have an administration that's going to press it a little bit more. And so there's a macro urgency. The second is fundamental costs of certain technologies have dramatically gone down, which is helpful in being able to build and scale these businesses. And the third is capital and resources to build them. And I think we're at a tipping point where there's a huge amount of interest in this space, pretty newly. The bet we all make as investors in this category is it different than last time? Yes, right? That for some of those reasons I just mentioned, you have to believe, that structurally, partly because of that cost of technology, partly because of the capital involved, partly because of where the opportunity is sitting, there are differences than this last, boom of green tech. We believe that, but that's a bet you have to make. Most of our interest so far has been around decarbonization.
Okay.
Where there are opportunities to take carbon out, whether that's through seaweed, whether that's through soil, whether that's through reforestation, and technologies involved, like Remora, which is doing it through a device on the back of semi-trucks, Sylvia Terra, which changed its name, and, others like that. We don't think that's the only bucket we'll invest in. We're looking at many others, but right now, that's been where probably the bulk of our investing have gone.
And are there buckets within that where you've gone deep and said, okay, maybe the technology isn't really going to work here, it might not be big enough, it might not be impactful enough, that maybe founders are building in right now that can think about exactly how a VC focus on this area thinks about it too?
I think we believe that in ocean, soil, and reforestation, there will be many big companies that are doing decarbonization. Some will have more effect than others on what scale. We've been interested in measurement tools, right? Because part of this is being able to understand how effective these businesses are, and many of those tools are still quite early. So we've been interested in various measurement tools. And then there's the whole world of the carbon offset world, right? And is it going to be that each of these technologies build direct relationships to effectively, buy and sell carbon, or is it going to be, more macro marketplaces? And so we've looked at that some as well and have invested there. I mean, we think there's opportunity all over this, basically. There's a lot of opportunity in food. We haven't invested in that yet, but have spent a fair amount of time looking and will. We're very interested in the overlap between crypto and climate, and where there's opportunities around incentivizing large networks and climate, since climate is so spread out and so decentralized by definition, there is really interesting potential overlap there. We haven't made an investment yet, but very much would like to and are looking. So there's more places we see massive opportunity than areas we don't right now.
Right. And do you see any major challenges or obstacles that climate tech founders are going to face? Is it regulatory, where one administration to another continues to switch? Is it capital perhaps not going to it as quick as it should, or maybe going to the wrong areas?
There are massive operational. These are, it's so. One of my favorite things about focusing on climate as part of our efforts the last 18 or 24 months. Besides that, I think it's extremely important for the world, and that, commercial technologies are going to drive a lot of the meaningful change. It's so fun to learn about new categories that you previously hadn't focused on, and go really deep and learn the opportunity. But one of the interesting things is I actually think the challenges here are not going to be structural. Will there be regulatory challenges on some of them? Yes, you think about fusion and those kind of things. I think there will be regulatory challenges. Will there be capital challenges? I don't know. There's a lot of capital going into this space. There's a lot of capital going into, all spaces right now, but particularly I think there's going to be a lot of capital here. These are operationally intensive businesses. Like, USV has a history in software investing. Many of them have network effects. The whole beauty of network effects, right, is that you build something and there's a kind of momentum to them that builds when network effects tips. Some of these have that, but many of them are extremely operationally intensive businesses and will be for a long time. So one thing that's fun and interesting is learning about that kind of challenge, right? And all businesses have it in different ways, and team building and company building, but even, where we should take science risk, where there's real product risk, things like that. But I think those may be the bigger challenges than the structural challenges right now in this market.
Got it. Okay. That's very interesting. So I know we're at 2 minutes left, so I'm going to see if I can get through two questions fairly quickly. But sure. In this capital-rich environment, has USV had to look inward and change any major strategies or think about how do we operate in this new market? Or is it really, do you believe, just a phase and USV will continue to do well the way it has in the past?
I don't know if it's a phase or not, but I think USV can continue to do well, kind of whether or not it's a phase. It's been a really interesting and exciting time for USV even in this market. I think we've done a lot of looking inwards, but in some ways it's made us double down on certain parts of our strategy. The things we've changed are we've raised this additional climate fund. Probably our average ownership has gone down as entry prices. Series A's are bigger. There is no doubt about it. Right. Our initial checks are probably a little bit bigger. We made our fund a little bit bigger, but not a lot. But overall, every time we look inward, we kind of say, okay, we need to figure out, I think what this market presses investors to do is say, what's core? What do you hold as kind of core value? And where should you be flexible? And you need to know both, right? Like if you hold too much as core value, the era of saying we must invest $4 to $7 million to own 20%, like it's not realistic right now. And if you do that, I think you're going to miss out on too many opportunities. But to say we should flex that, but to a limit, right? Or something that's core to us is the thesis that we're investing behind and a certain level of ownership and, what we call a high conviction, low velocity strategy. Like we're not going to change that about ourselves, even if we sometimes get 10 to 12% going in versus 15 to 20% going in. That's okay. So those are the kind of conversations we've had versus, should we dramatically change who we are?
Got it. Rebecca, thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.